I'm Kwame Holman for the Black Power Chronicles. Today with Gladys Mack, a former top official in the first Marion Barry administration in Washington, D.C., one of the top budget experts early in that administration and going forward. Gladys, thank you.
Pleased to be here.
Gladys, listening to your interview that you did for the Marion Barry Chronicles, for the Marion Barry Oral Histories for the Gelman Library, we got your lineage in Washington, D.C. and the things you've done, and then your life in federal government and district government, and then as a top budget official. I thought we could talk about, in the context of the Black Power movement, which everyone of that era observed and saw and felt in various ways. As a young person working in Washington in the late 60s, as the freedom rides were going on, as the organizing by Marion Barry and Frank Smith and Stokely Carmichael was going on, what were you hearing about this new idea beyond what Dr. King and SCLC were talking about, this new idea of Black Power? How did you come to know about it? How did you perceive it?
I came to know about it because I have always been in constant search of news, of learning, and just being exposed to whatever is happening in the environment. Before I came to Washington, I was in college at Morgan State, and at that point the sit-ins were just occurring. I didn't participate in them. These were the restaurant sit-ins, and I came to Washington and went to work for the government, for the federal government right away, and so I was kind of an observer to what was going on, but keenly aware of and supporting the efforts that were changing the environment. It was clear that change was occurring, and it was important to be, at that point, kind of a witness to it. I was raising a family, had 3 young children, and my husband was an activist, and he was much more involved in some of the organizations that were part of this Black Power movement. But it was always, I was kind of, at that point, a real cheerleader on the sideline, watching and praying for progress and success.
Progress and success, that's how you perceived the Black Power movement, and yet the Dr. King and the traditional civil rights groups were in some sense at odds with the Black Power movement. What did you perceive the Black Power advocates and activists to be saying different from that which was coming from the traditional civil rights community?
Well, I would say at that time my thinking was pretty conservative. I certainly understood much better the Martin Luther King movement, but I was excited about another voice, and I also have always been aware that with change, there has to be struggle, there has to be new ideas, and a little bit of disruption. So I was not actually a part of that, but I understood it and truly supported it. Sometimes I wasn't courageous enough to support some of the efforts that seemed a little bit, outside of the mainstream. But nevertheless, I was always watching carefully and, wanting to be a part of it, at least, spiritually.
A number of people have said that they thought that the struggle, setting aside any difference with the civil rights movement, the traditional civil rights movement, they were saying the same thing, of course, but they saw the Black Power movement as a demand for personhood, a demand to throw off the dominant culture's view of Black people.
I agree with that, and actually the thing that impressed me about it a lot was the fact that the males, the black males, were leading the movement. They were out front in my exposure as an adult in the work world, and where there was leadership, often the leadership came from the women and not the men. And so hearing the voices of the men, sometimes they were a little too strident for my taste, but I realized how important it was, and so that attracted me the most. And also having a husband who was an activist and being a mother of 3 sons, I was really interested in, male survival and progress and just learning.
You talked about how, early in your career as a government worker, moving up toward the top echelons of government, you found black women in positions, but not black men. And talk about that.
Well, that was an interesting experience. I was recruited to come to the federal government. I wanted to be a teacher like my mother in South Carolina, and so I majored in business subjects, and I was going to go teach business in high school. But I got recruited by the federal government that came to Morgan looking for students who were graduating who had business education experience. And 4 of my classmates came to the federal government. They were recruited there. And when we got there, we found that the white people who were competing for the same jobs were all high school students from West Virginia. And so the same recruiters had come to black colleges and to white high schools to look for the same talent. And that was interesting. However, the 4 of us who came to the federal government with our college degrees ended up in career ladder positions because we had access. We were there, we were secretaries, but we were demonstrating our capability, and our bosses saw what we could do. And for myself, I had a woman boss who was very open to accepting and pushing my potential. And so there were many black women like me all throughout the federal government who had gotten to be managers and supervisors simply because they'd started out, shown their talent, and were given the responsibility. Like the guys who came into the federal government, I don't think I knew many men at all who went above they were chauffeurs and they were in the mailroom, and so they were facilities people, but none of them were in the environment that gave them an opportunities that the women had. And that was, of course, by design, but it also was just the way business was being done at that time.
And when Marion Barry would put together that first cabinet, you would come to be in awe, you had been saying, of the fact that all of these top flight African American administrators were there in that city cabinet, and given your experience before, it was an astounding thing. You would witness Marion Barry early on, some of the other people in the civil rights movement, in the Black Power movement / civil rights movement, Frank Smith, others. You would watch them matriculate in the city.
Absolutely.
You would work in the early administration, the home rule administration, as self-government began to evolve for the citizens of the District of Columbia. Marion Barry would win that 1978 upset victory. You talked about in your George Washington University interview the sort of, there were two candidates who were more favored by the black middle class, and again, this was a city that was 73% black, so, and so how the black vote went really determined who would be mayor. There were two candidates who were attractive to the black middle class. Mr. Barry was attractive to lower income African Americans for his stridency and program aimed at trying to lift them up.
Exactly.
What did the black middle class think about this black power candidate, if you will?
It was my experience that the black middle class, which was very large in DC and very comfortable, made up of very accomplished professionals, administrators of every in every area, and they feared somebody like Marion Barry coming in and upsetting kind of the complacency that they had found. So that was not viewed very favorably. So he had a difficult time winning over that group. And so when he decided that he was going to run for mayor, that he was not warmly embraced by that group. And in fact, Sterling Tucker, who had been head of the Urban League, and most people knew Sterling, and of course most people were very favorable of the Urban League as opposed to SNCC. And so Sterling was kind of the favorite for the middle class to upper middle class blacks at that time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Did you perceive, everyone knew in that 1978 election that Marion Barry was the first chairman of SNCC, that he talked about black power. He tried to, when he was running Pride Incorporated, the idea was to empower economically young black men from poor neighborhoods. Did you perceive his mayoral agenda, his campaign agenda, as a black power agenda?
Not especially. Marion was pretty much known by the people who were not directly involved in his efforts as a guy who changed things. For example, one of his crusades, as I'm sure you know, was the O'Rourke chalk. The bus transportation system was getting in trouble because at that time, most public transit systems were being turned over to the public sector because they had stopped making money, and just before the turnover, the transit fares were going up tremendously, and so the owner of the O'Rourke chalk, owner of the transit company here, had a big raise in fares, and Marion, that was one of the efforts that Marion decided to take on, and he actually called for a strike and had a big organization against these fares, and in fact he eventually won, and to the great benefit of the system. So I personally kind of saw him as a guy who would disrupt the system enough to get some changes, but I even personally was a little uncomfortable if the disruption got to a place where, you know, I wasn't sure that was an area that I wanted him to go in. But he was so popular because it was clear, even for us who were looking at him at a distance, that he cared about people. I mean, we loved the Pride situation that had done so extremely well, the bus situation. And then shortly after that, he ran for the school board, and it was, whenever he was moving forward, he was very successful, but it always was like, you know, he was like the kid who stood up in the dashiki, which was very different from what everybody else was wearing, but he was fascinating because he generally turned out to be right in his efforts, and so that factor just won people over and started changing the image of him to a large extent. But it wasn't until actually, well, even after he got to be mayor, for the black middle class, they really had a wait and see attitude. Yeah, it was amazing that many, and just to talk about who the voters were when Marion won, Marion had great support from the white neighborhoods, and back in that day, the real estate, well, actually, that continued to be the case. You know, the public utilities, the housing, and all of that created a kind of de facto segregation. So in the wards, mostly white wards in the city, Marion was spending his time, you know, campaigning there. A lot of people thought that that effort was kind of a futile effort because, you know, he wasn't really acceptable to us, so why do we think he's going to be acceptable to them? And he surprised everybody when it was clear that he was garnering serious support of the white community, the white business people, and it began to change a lot of minds. He got the endorsement of the Washington Post, which was amazing. So it was a very significant time for change in the city. And I always think, and it actually is true, that Marion changed the paradigm an awful lot for blacks in particular, but just for the city in general, because while Marion had a Black Power program, he was interested in overall progress, and he wanted everybody to succeed. It was clear that he had a very good relationship with the business community and won their favor because everybody could see, even though he was strident, even though you disagreed with a lot of his ideas, he was about success and about moving things forward. And he succeeded in doing that and succeeded in bringing people with him.
Could it be said that white voters, white residents in the district at that time were in favor of a Black Power, progressive, Democratic, they were mostly members of the Democratic Party, an agenda that corresponded with what Marion Barry, the SNCC chairman, was talking about, bringing economic development to low-income black communities and even providing access to city contracts to minority business people. Was there no, as you sat with cabinet members in those first days, weeks, and months of that first administration, and we heard stories of Marion insisting to people who held the bonds, et cetera, for the city, that black entrepreneurs and representatives be part of that process, that other kinds of city work go to black people. As you observed these high-powered white business people and other residents of the city, was that too much black power, or what went on in those early days?
Well, absolutely not, because it was the kind of strategy, Marion's strategy, helped the businessmen, the black businessmen. His effort caused the black businessmen to have success where they really had almost no investment in the city, because the contracting was designed in such a way that they couldn't qualify for it, or didn't have the capital, or didn't have the insurance that was necessary. And so Marion's effort was to change the minority contracting percentage, so that minority contractors would be guaranteed a larger part of the action, and then just taught them, and particularly after the elected council was seated, taught them how to lobby the Congress, the council people, and just to use the efforts to use their abilities. Again, it gave them access. Access is the key word, and I had talked about access before in terms of moving up. You have to have access to show what you can do. And Marion was able to do that, and as a result of those efforts, there were many, many businessmen who had opportunities that they never otherwise would have had he not come in and kind of broken the ice for them and allowed them to do what they could do.
So whether it's called minority contractor participation or giving opportunity to people who traditionally didn't have it, or a Black Power agenda, the result was the same.
Absolutely, and that was so demonstrated by the relationship that he was able to build with the businessmen in the city, because most of the businessmen at that time, and even maybe today, many of them did not live in the city. And so their major interest in the city was, their businesses and their ability to serve in whatever way their businesses committed. And Marion facilitated that as well. So it was a matter of let's make the city work better for everybody. And in order to do that, then we've got to get everybody who's got a role in this invested in that progress. And he was able to do that.
Mm-hmm. As you and the others of this all-star cabinet of Marion Barry's would talk in the late hours and at meetings and skull sessions and so forth, the idea was to help empower poor people, help empower Black people who hadn't had an opportunity to have access to certain kinds of business. Was it ever said by Marion, by Ivanhoe Donaldson, also a veteran of the Black Power movement?
Right. This
is Black Power, and this is what and why we must continue to pursue it?
Not really. I think the image that people began to get of Marion was that he wanted opportunities. He wanted to get rid of the paradigm here in Washington was that there was a level that Black people could achieve, and they couldn't go over that level. So his was not so much rejecting the white community and the white business people. His was just, let's all do the right thing. Let's all give everybody an equal opportunity to succeed and to achieve. And I think his efforts were seen that way. I don't, and of course, after he got to be mayor, which, the mayor in DC is a very, very powerful position. So after he got to be mayor, it gave him a lot of leverage to bring people together that might never have even spoken to each other, because everybody understood how powerful the mayor is, and the mayor could make things happen. And Marion clearly was interested in making things happen on all levels. You mentioned earlier, how he, or I mentioned how he gave opportunities where there were no opportunities. When I was the budget director, the interesting thing about being the budget director is that you get to make a whole lot of decisions that don't have much airing until they get exposed. So things just happen, and you don't quite know what makes them happen. So when I was preparing the budget, my first year preparing the budget, Marion told me, he said, I want you to double the budget for the arts program, the Department of Arts, because that's really important, and this is too little. I want you to double that program. I want you to double the program for senior citizens, And every year that I was budget director, his mandate to me was to double the budget for Office on Aging and the budget for the senior citizens. And as a result of that, as you know, those programs are flourishing today. When the district hit hard times, they really had a foundation that kind of they could build on when things improved. And now we have, I'm sure, a foremost program with the arts department and with the senior citizens department. And so he had appeal across the board. And this is the other thing that I learned about him. It was just so interesting. You know, when you saw him from afar, you know, he was this guy, dashiki oftentimes back then, just a very attractive personality. But if you got up close, you began to see that the man was brilliant. You just didn't know that looking at him from afar. And so you began to realize that he had interest everywhere. I mean, he had interest in education. He was on the Board of Education, which was his first elected position. And he was able to navigate from one type of service, one type of program to another, and make it work. It was like going around fixing things that weren't working before. So he had a lot of appeal, and people just loved him. It was just so amazing. He would just go into a crowd, and it was just magnetic. In fact, one of my sons told me recently, this was just shortly before Marion died, one of the guys in the community, I think he was a musician, and they had a big funeral for him at the convention center. And Marion was late. He's always late whenever he comes. He came into the funeral late, and as he showed in the door, hundreds of people stood up and applauded him in the middle of the funeral. But that's how people felt about him, because it was clear that he was sincere. He was not about advancing himself. He was really about giving people an opportunity to prove what they could do. And I personally felt that, because when I got to know him, I was working for the previous mayor, Walter Washington, and I was the deputy budget director at that time. And Marion was head of the budget for the council. So we interacted a lot. And it turns out that we hit it off because he was always just very studious about whatever he was involved in. And when you were going to have a conversation with Marion, you really had to be prepared. So we kind of got on very well. And so he was just kind of a hero to all that who came in contact with him, because you had the feeling that you came away just being more knowledgeable, just being able to be more successful at whatever it is that you were accomplishing. So when he asked me to serve in his cabinet, of course I was really honored. I had been a deputy, and he knew me from our interaction, but to offer me a position such as that was just incredible. There were very few women at that point, if none, head of budget in a major city. I mean, that was really breaking ground. But Marion loved doing that. You know, he loved putting people in positions to give them an opportunity to succeed, and that was, for me, tremendous. I will never forget, that first year when we went to Capitol Hill, there were two important issues, well, two that stood out. There were always important issues on the Hill. And as you know, at the time, not only did Congress have to approve the district's budget, but they had line item approval. So we would spend hours and hours on the Hill talking to congressmen. And one of the issues that was front and center was the lottery. The council had voted on the lottery, but the Congress wasn't that happy about the lottery. And so Marion decided that he and I were going to go visit every member of the Appropriations Committee. I mean, it's a big committee. It was pretty big. We didn't get to see them all. But we went to Jamie Whitten, and I don't know if you know that name or not, but he was chair of the Appropriations Committee in the House. And he was so happy to see Marion. This was so funny because he said, yeah, young fella, I've been watching you. He says, and I saw you when you were up on the steps of the Capitol protesting. I don't even remember what Marion was protesting. He said, and I've been watching you, and you've been doing a good job. Now, this guy's from Mississippi, and known to be not that liberal, but he took pride in the success that Marion was having, and that's kind of how he impressed people. We went to see the Senator Bumpers from Arkansas, I think he was, and everywhere we went, people greeted Marion warmly, and many of them had stories to tell about the things that he had been doing. So while the Congress, these people didn't have any direct interaction with him, they were watching what he was doing, and I guess many times in fear, but when he succeeded, they were wonderful to support him, although they probably never would have supported him publicly. But we walked the halls of Congress, boy, lobbying for the lottery, and it ended up getting approved. But here was the other thing. The Congressman Natcher from Kentucky was head of the Appropriations Committee for the district for many, many, many years. And Congressman Natcher had he favored libraries. So in the district appropriation each year, he put another library. We have probably the greatest library system of any city our size. So, and the other thing that he was in favor was the police. So when we were trying to get the lottery approved, and Congressman Natcher wanted Marion to add some more police, so they kind of traded off. He got Congressman Natcher's vote on the police, and pushed the lottery. So there was horse trading. So it was a very interesting experience, really, just to get on the inside of that operation and to see how it worked. And Marion was able to get inside just because of the size of his figure and his mission.
So when he would ask you, his budget director, to double the money for senior citizens programs, to put in money for job training, for the summer youth program that would be
exactly.
his legacy, to fund the arts, it happened that the seniors who would benefit happened to be largely African American because the city was largely African American.
Absolutely.
Gladys, when you hear people talking, and I wonder if you see any hyperbole whatsoever, that it's been said Marion Barry created a new black middle class. There was an existing ample black middle class in the city, but Marion Barry, through his multiple administrations, created a new black middle class that now flourishes just outside the city and in the city in Prince George's County. How do you perceive, and you're a numbers person, I mean, do you accept the idea that by empowering black business people in the minority contracting field, by bringing in people into government, by funding programs, that he did all that, created all that power, if you will, for black people?
Well, absolutely, that's true. And I was at an event once with the county executive Wayne Curry, and Marion was there, and they joked about how Marion had created all this middle class that moved to Prince George's County, and so Marion had sent him all these voters. But Marion changed the makeup of the middle class because he gave the opportunity. The middle class in D.C. before Marion's was largely teachers. They were government workers, and not many businessmen. Maybe some small businesses, but no really large black-owned businesses. So he diversified, I guess, the middle class, and because he hired in the district government. For example, when I went into the district government as a budget analyst, I was the first black budget analyst in the district government, and that was in the late 60s. So there were government employees, but there weren't business people, and so and of course, you know, the government people have a salary, but the business people have an opportunity to build investment, to build capital, and that was the dimension that Marion gave to the black middle class that it didn't have before.
Absolutely. Cheryl, can we pause 1 second? I didn't bring a kerchief, but Gladys has just a little tear under her left eye. If we have a tissue.
Sure, I'll bring one.
Thank you, Cheryl. Then we're getting very close. Thank you.
Okay.
That's great. Just a little under.
I think I feel it right there.
just
Yeah.
Didn't want it to be distracting to the audience. You know how audience members can get fixated on
Yeah,
stuff.
you can hold
Right.
this.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
That's
Okay,
great.
thanks.
Because when he's talking, the camera's not on you.
Oh, okay.
So you feel like
Right.
you need
Okay,
to
good.
Do you?
Thanks.
Oh,
You
I
good?
think I'm fine, sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, you can pick up whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Cheryl. And so, Gladys, again, there was an existing black middle class, and you just said Marion Barry helped create a new black middle class composed of people who hadn't been middle class before, had been lower income. But again, was that, as all of you top officials in the government observed those economic changes happening for people, did you say, this is black power?
Not really. We didn't define it that way. Clearly, it was black power. But we thought of it as having an opportunity to move forward, to do the things that were always available to other people but not available to us. So we didn't really define that as black power, although obviously it was. So that's, and I think, you know, the thing I like to think about when you're talking about this is, you know, change is tough. Change is difficult, and people don't like change. And so if somebody shows up and leaves you with the impression that their goal is to change whatever it is you're doing, you're going to be skeptical. So I think a lot of that was seen. And then, of course, when it's clear that the change is going to happen, it gets embraced, and you know, people forget that they were skeptical about it in the beginning. And I think a lot of that happened. But Marion did indeed change the city so completely, and a lot of it was by changing the government. We had a government that had a very disproportionate population of district residents who were black, as opposed to the high-level jobs that were available. And Marion brought more equity. People were able to move up based on their ability and their skills And those are the ones that moved out to Prince George's County because they could buy nice houses out there that were cheap in the district. But I think going back to the idea that people don't like change and are afraid of what might happen if the apple cart gets upset, they come slow to it. But once that it's clear that that opportunity is there, they embrace it. And Black Power, I think, gained some acceptance, but it was only when it did gain acceptance that people would talk about Black Power. But until that time, it was out there with some rabble rousers. And so these people, not thinking of themselves as rabble rousers, never really firmly identified with the Black Power.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Gladys, Marion Barry, Ivanhoe Donaldson, top officials in the government of the District of Columbia, veterans of the Black Power movement, really were unique, however, in that other SNCC veterans, Black Power movement veterans did not enter elective politics, enter elective office, become administrators. How do you think about that in the 3-4 decades that have happened since? Did Black Power fail to, and cities, urban cities with continuing problems, African American young people with continuing problems of access and opportunity, did Black Power fail?
No, I don't think Black Power failed, and I just talked about some of the progress that came from Black Power for the people who became middle class and moved out. But Black Power today, by a different name, still struggles because for the question with equality, the question of equal opportunities, the question that, for example, take the cities. The cities were failing across the country, and white flight happened, urban renewal. So the middle class moved out to the suburbs in the era of the car and the highway. So the cities were deserted and decaying, but the focus of attention moved, and when the white flight, so that the focus of the attention moved, and the people who were left in the cities did not have the employment, they didn't have the earnings, they didn't have the interest of the businessmen to come and keep it up because much of their customer base was lost in the white flight. And after that period, I think it's progressive. So the Black Power didn't fail, but it didn't do everything it had hoped to do. And there's always another kind of movement coming to take its place. I mean, Black Lives Matter has brought into consciousness some of the bias that's in the woven into the way our society operates. And discrimination is alive and well. And so whatever population is trying to achieve some growth and stability, they have to first overcome the whole issue of discrimination. And discrimination is just really very stubborn. It just does not give up. And what happens a lot of times, you think maybe things have been conquered in one area, but then it moves to some other area. So, but one of the areas that has not really changed that much has been the housing and the employment opportunities. That's the other thing. If you look now in the district, where the population is changing tremendously and the white flight has reversed, the few district residents that are left, I think the poverty is like 20%. And the kind of new paradigm for the cities, and this is not only happening in the district, but that new paradigm still leaves a group of disadvantaged people who are disadvantaged because of education, or they're disadvantaged because the community did not offer opportunities for learning and for moving forward. And then there is this whole group of unrest. I mean, and young people today have the same notion of unrest as what was brought on by the Black Power, but everything in the environment has changed, so that has changed too. And success comes very slow, very slow. So you can't call it a failure. You have to look at the progress that grew out of the efforts, which the message then is the struggle has to continue. And as it continues, there will be other progress. But often it's said is that the people who create the revolution never get an opportunity to enjoy it. And to some extent, that is happening in this country with African Americans. And we have some of the same issues we had back when Marion was trying to promote equal opportunity, but we have some different issues. And they're nonetheless as difficult to overcome.
It makes me think of if the revolutionaries often don't reap the benefits of their revolution, Marion Barry himself in his final years would live in a small apartment, have health and economic challenges and so forth. You have some feelings about that.
Oh, I do. I do. I had the opportunity to go to his funeral, which was held at the Washington Convention Center, and I think there were 25,000 people, or it was a lot of people there. And there were a lot of speakers. There were probably 15 or 20 speakers at the funeral, and there were blacks in particular who came forward to talk about how they never could have achieved what they achieved under Marion Barry. And he made, given opportunities to several people who spoke there that, and they are now big multimillionaires, owning a lot of property, having a lot of access. And unfortunately, Marion created all that prosperity, but he never enjoyed it himself. And that was the nature of the man. Unfortunately, he was never selfish about his giving. And in a way, we talk about great figures. He was a Martin Luther King of his ilk, because he was helping people, helping them to become independent, helping them to enjoy all the opportunities that were available to others but not available to blacks. And then he ended up with none of these opportunities himself. And I have always hoped that his progress and all the things that he did would outlive those last few years when he actually people said, oh, Marion Barry. I mean, whenever his name came up, all they could remember was the experience with drugs or some other issue, and the fact that he had a tax problem. And those are the kinds of things that today's generation thinks about. And my goal would be that he outlive all of that and people get to know what a truly great man he was. And I always marveled at, one of the things I used to say, that Marion was the only person that I knew that looked better close up than he did at a distance. So if you got to know him, you would be so impressed with just his vision, and how he just believed that people could grow, they could get better, they could succeed, and he sort of inspired people to live out that vision that he had. He was really one of a kind.
This last question may be impossible to answer, Gladys, but as you look through the arc of his career, SNCC chairman and Pride Incorporated, getting young men jobs and learning how to work, school board, and with bringing a Black Power philosophy, was it Marion Barry the person first, or was it the Black Power civil rights movement that created him? In other words, absent the Black Power movement, would Marion Barry have been the same, or can that be known?
Well, I don't think you can know that, because I think they found each other. He would have been, the Marion Barry I knew was always in search. In fact, you know, his whole education background, here he was at University of Tennessee, I think, all but thesis for his PhD, and he got stricken by the Black Power movement and left that behind, and he was there looking for, you know, his opportunity, the thing that really, he was doing great, moving in one direction, but he got pulled in by the Black Power movement, and so I think that was what he was supposed to do. I kind of feel that, you know, your fate finds you, and I think it found him and created him. And I also felt in the later years, I also thought Marion had been so successful in his life. In everything he did, he was able to conceive, had a vision to make things happen and to make them better. And I always thought that perhaps when he got caught up with drugs, that he really probably thought he could overcome that too. Or if he had ever thought that it would reduce him to not being able to keep moving in the direction he was moving, I think he just never would have done it. Because it was, I think he just got caught up in circumstances and couldn't find a way out. Because we used to talk about that, he and I used to talk about that, about how he wanted to find a way out, but he was such a target. And you remember this, when he sought drug treatment, the reporters and the cameras went to the facility where he was trying to get treatment, and you know, there was an article in the paper every day about Marion Barry at drug treatment. So he couldn't outrun his reputation after he had become so popular. And, you know, having been left alone, perhaps that never would have ended that way. But, you know, who can say? He was just, he lived the part of his time. And again, my hope is that history will record as much effort that's been spent on the bad times. I think maybe, as happens, people do outlive their foibles, and all the good things they do rise. And I think Marion has done so much that that will happen. I do.
Gladys Mack, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Great to talk about a time that I was just so privileged to be a part of.